While the Terror is the most dramatic phase of the Revolution, it had less influence on the formation of modern France than the great reforms of the Constituent Assembly. French historians see this period from August 1792 to July 1794 as a time when extremist Sans-Culottes knocked the revolution off course. They forced the country's leaders to adopt policies that were contrary to the liberal reforms of the Constituent Assembly. Their support was necessary to preserve the revolution, but they did not make any permanent gains for themselves or any lasting changes. After the fall of Robespierre, the revolution they maintained returned to its earlier course. The symbol of the Terror is the guillotine, and it is this image that most people have in mind when they think of the French Revolution. Bloodthirsty purges, terrified citizens, dictatorship, and the suppression of liberties, which had been so triumphantly announced in the Declaration of the Rights of 1789, are all associated with the Terror. Government by terror came into being because of a need to organize a republic against internal and external threats to its survival. There were two periods of the terror, and both were associated with the war abroad. The first began with the attack on the Tuileries on August 10, 1792, included the September massacres, and came to an end with the Battle of Valmy, when the Allied invasion was held up and then pushed back. The second period began with the journey of May 31st to June 2nd, 1793, when some Girondin deputies were arrested, and ended with the execution of Robespierre and his supporters in July 1794. It was clear to some politicians that in order to fight a war against both internal and external enemies, the support of the people was necessary. To achieve this, some popular demands would have to be granted. This was realized first of all by the Montagnards, and just as the Montagnards were drawing closer to the Sans-Culottes, the Plain was drawing closer to the Montagnards. Its members shared the Girondin hatred of Robespierre and Marat, but they held the Girondins responsible for the failures in the war abroad, the rising in the Vendée, and the economic crisis. After all, several ministers were Girondins. The Plain therefore joined the Montagnards in favoring repressive measures. Barré, a leader of the Plain, told the convention that it should recognize three things. In a state of emergency, no government could rule by normal methods. The bourgeoisie should not isolate itself from the people whose demands should be satisfied. And lastly, since it was vital the bourgeoisie retain control of this alliance with the people, the convention must take the initiative by introducing the necessary measures. Against the background of mounting problems, military defeat, civil war, severe economic problems, and anti-republican opposition, which threatened to overturn the revolution, the convention passed a range of measures between March 10th and May 20th, 1793, designed to deal with these problems and ensure its survival. They had three objectives: to identify, place under observation, and punish suspects, to make government more effective and ensure that its orders were carried out, and to meet at least some of the economic demands of the Sans-Culottes. The task of rooting out all anti-republican opposition was given to the Committee of General Security. On March 10, 1793, a revolutionary tribunal was set up in Paris to try counter-revolutionary suspects. It was intended to prevent massacres like those of September 1792, but this tribunal was to become one of the main instruments of what became known as the Terror. Owing to resistance to conscription, representatives on mission were sent to the provinces. They had almost unlimited powers over the department administration and the armies, and were intended as the first stage in reasserting central control over the provinces. Plots by royalists were blamed for the rising in the Vendée, so committees of surveillance were set up in each commune and each section of major towns. They provided many victims for the Revolutionary Tribunal. Severe measures were taken against rebels. The summary execution decree provided for the trial and execution of armed rebels within 24 hours of capture. These trials were held without a jury, and there was no appeal. They condemned many more victims than the Revolutionary Tribunal itself did. Very harsh laws were also passed against émigrés. Their property was confiscated by government officials, and they were to be executed if they ever returned to France. On April 6, 1793, one of the most important decisions taken by the convention was to set up the Committee of Public Safety. Its purpose was to supervise and speed up the activities of ministers whose authority it superseded. The CPS was not a dictatorship, though. It depended on the support of the convention, which approved its powers each month. As to the composition of the new committee, Danton, supported by the Plain, wanted a committee without extremists. Thus, of the 9 members selected in April, 7, including Barré, were from the Plain. There were only 2 members from the Mountain, and of whom Danton was one, and no Girondins at all. Danton and Robespierre spoke of the need for winning the support of the people for the Republic. This, they felt, could be done by economic concessions. On May 4th, a maximum price, which the Girondins opposed in principle, was fixed for grain, and later in the month, a compulsory loan was imposed on the wealthy. All these measures, revolutionary tribunals, representatives on mission, watch committees, the CPS, and the summary execution decree, were vital parts of the machinery of the terror. At first, they were applied only partially, if at all, outside the Vendée. Danton and other Montagnards had asked the Girondins to stop attacking Parisian Sans-Culottes, but to no avail. On May 26, Robespierre came down on the side of the Sans-Culottes when he invited the people to place themselves in insurrection against the corrupt Girondin deputies. On May 31st, a rising began which spread rapidly when news of the overthrow of Jacobins in Lyon reached Paris on June 1st. On June 2nd, 80,000 National Guardsmen surrounded the convention and directed their cannon at it. They demanded the expulsion of the Girondins from the assembly and a maximum price imposed on all essential goods. When the deputies tried to leave, they were forced back. For the first time, armed force was being used against an elected assembly. To avoid a massacre or seizure of power by a revolutionary commune, the convention was compelled to agree to the arrest of 29 Girondin deputies and 2 ministers. Following the purge of the Girondins, a young royalist, Charlotte Corday, assassinated Marat in a vain belief that it would end the revolution. As the military crisis worsened, Montagnard Jacobin deputies turned on the Girondins. During the political crisis of June 1793, the Girondin deputies were expelled from the convention for supporting revolts backed by royalists aimed at destroying the unity of the Republic. In fact, both sides believed in the unity of the Republic, and the revolts had initially nothing to do with royalism or counter-revolution. The Montagnards called these revolts federalism, and were concerned not only was that the unity of the Republic under threat, but that with fighting a war as well, the government's resources would be placed under a very severe strain. In many departments, the rebels resented the influence of Paris and its commune over the convention and the power of the Jacobins. The first significant city to rebel was Marseille. Its inhabitants turned against the local Jacobin club. Encouraged by these events, anti-Jacobin supporters took control of many other towns and cities in the south. The most serious revolt occurred in Lyon, the Republic's second largest city. Bordeaux reacted to the purge of the Girondin deputies by declaring the city in revolt until they were restored. Some form of disturbance occurred in 60 of the 83 departments, although there was significant resistance to the convention in only 8. Potentially the most serious revolt was in the great naval base of Toulon. Disillusion with the war in the course of the revolution led to an uprising which overthrew the town council and closed down the Jacobin club. The government cut off food supplies to the city. To prevent starvation, the town authorities negotiated with the British, who insisted that the monarchy be restored. British troops entered the town on August 28th. As half the French fleet was lying off the coast of Toulon, this was a most serious blow to the Republic. Once the towns of Marseille, Lyon, and Toulon rejected the authority of the Convention, many smaller towns in the Rhone Valley and Provence followed suit. Despite the attempts of the Jacobin press to portray them as pro-church monarchists, many of the Federalists were supporters of the Republic. According to rebels in Toulon, all they wanted was to enjoy our goods, our property, the fruits of our toil and industry in peace. Yet we see them increasingly exposed to threats from those who have nothing themselves. However, federal forces were small. Marseille was only able to raise about 3,500 men, Bordeaux 400, and none of them wanted to move far from home. This failure to cooperate enabled the government to pick off the rebel areas one by one. After June 2nd, most of the deputies feared or distrusted the Montagnards because of the way they had dealt with the Girondins. However, they did not want to see the Republic overthrown by domestic or foreign enemies, and so for the next 14 months, they were quiet. When a new CPS was formed between July and September 1793, all of the 12 members were either Montagnards or deputies of the Plain who had joined them. All were middle class except for one who was a former noble. 8 of them were lawyers, 2 were engineers. Nearly all were young. The average age was just 30. There was no chairman. All the members were jointly responsible for the committee's action. The new committee was to become the first strong government since the revolution began. These are the leading members of the Committee of Public Safety who are going to be in control during the terror. And as you can see, in some cases, after turning on everybody else, they just turned on each other. Other cases, they live a long life. It just depended, I suppose, on their role during the terror. Maximilian Robespierre joined the CPS in July 1793. Owing to his influence in the Jacobin Club and the Paris Commune, he was expected to provide a link between the middle-class Jacobins and the Sans-Culottes. He never had much support in the Convention, though, and many could not stand his narrow self-righteousness. Yet he was known as the Incorruptible because he did not seek power or wealth for himself, and was consistent in putting the good of the country above all other considerations. Robespierre believed that the principles were everything, human beings nothing. Anyone who did not put virtue first would have to be sacrificed. It was Robespierre's tactical skill that led him to ally with the Sans-Culottes. He saw the need for the Montagnards to be allied to the people if the revolution was to survive. Although Robespierre shared many ideas with the Sans-Culottes and was popular with the people of Paris, he was never one of them. He dressed with the silk stockings, knee breeches, and powdered wig of the old regime. He never took part in the demonstration and was never carried shoulder high by the people as Marat was. Robespierre was a rather remote figure who lived comfortably, rather modestly though, in a bourgeoisie household of a cabinet maker in Dupleix. The growth in the power of the Sans-Culottes was largely a consequence of the war. They had played an important role in the revolution in 1789 by storming the Bastille and by bringing the king to Paris during the October days, but after that the bourgeoisie National Guard kept them under control, as at the Champ de Mars massacre. However, when the National Guard was opened up to passive citizens in July 1792, the Sans-Culotte militants grew in influence. Their power and dominance was important in the overthrow of the monarchy, and from the summer of 1792 to the spring of 1794, no one could control Paris without obtaining their support. The main characteristics of the Sans-Culottes were that they hated the aristocracy and anyone of great wealth. They believed in egalitarianism and as a result addressed everyone as a citizen. They wore the red cap of the revolution. They were passionately anti-clericalism. This was probably because priests had joined with the aristocrats in taking wealth created by ordinary men. And they also had a belief in direct democracy. For the Sans-Culottes, the sovereignty of the people, their right to exercise power, could not be delegated to representatives. They believed that the people had the right to control and change their government at any time, and if they were betrayed, they had the right of insurrection. Political life must take place in the open. The patriot had no reason to hide his opinions. The meetings of the assembly must therefore be open to the public, and deputies must vote aloud. The commune and the sections were the administrative units of Parisian local government with their officials and elected committees. They controlled the National Guard. While there was danger from internal and foreign enemies, they were encouraged by the government as they helped the war effort, kept watch on suspects, and assisted representatives on missions in purging local authorities. In 1793, they were often more important than the municipalities as they issued certificates of citizenship or proof of good citizenship and support for the Republic, without which no one could be employed. Each section was controlled by a small minority of militants, usually the better off members who had the time to devote to section business. The Parisian sans-culottes had the force with which to seize power, but they chose to persuade or intimidate the convention, never to replace it. They wholeheartedly supported the government on basic issues, such as their hatred of the aristocracy and in their determination to win the war. A series of concessions to the Sans-Culottes were made because they had helped the Jacobins gain power. A new constitution was presented to the people in June of 1793. It went much further than the original Declaration of Rights of 1789. It stated the right of people to work and for insurrection, and the right to have help in time of need and to be educated. All adult males were to have the vote, and there were to be direct elections. They also agreed to fight the war more effectively and instituted conscription. They also gave economic concessions such as fixing prices and making hoarding of goods a capital offense. The levee and masse, which was decreed in August 1793, marked the appearance of total war. It stated that until the enemies of France had been expelled from the territory of the Republic, all Frenchmen were in a state of permanent requisition for the army. Nearly 500,000 conscripts, unmarried men between 18 and 25, were called up to the army. They had to be fed, armed, and trained, so all the human and material resources of the nation were put at the government's disposal. State factories were set up to make arms and ammunition. Church bells were melted down for cannon, and religious vessels, such as chalices, for coinage. The government also took control of foreign trade and shipping. Government control of the economy harnessed the energies of the nation on an unprecedented scale. It was remarkably successful in the short term. Without it, victory would have been impossible.